Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits and I'm incredibly tactile. If you give me your broom, I shall grab that stick. If you give me your bed, I shall grab your... Okay, let's talk about Bedknobs and Broomsticks. That fantastic 1971 Disney musical film featuring the sainted Dame Angela Lansbury. And it's one of my favourite Disney films. Funnily enough, just by chance, it's been playing a lot in my mind just in the last couple of weeks in two totally different ways. The first comes about fairly obliquely. I was recently in correspondence with one of the people behind the fantastic Edinburgh show Redacted Arachnid, which, if you remember, we reviewed here on Musical Talk, and a copy of which you can see on YouTube. The company behind that show is called Maybe You Like It. And they've recently started broadcasting their own podcast, which sounds absolutely fabulous to me, because what they do is they take films, plays, or other things which have never been staged before, or are very likely never to be staged again, and then they talk about how they would stage them. And my mind immediately went to Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Like Mary Poppins, in its film version, there is a mixture of filmed live action and animation, and that's very difficult to pull off on stage. Now, Mary Poppins, which in a way is the sister film to Bedknobs and Broomsticks, made a very successful transition to stage, but Bedknobs and Broomsticks so far seems to have been ignored. And that, funnily enough, was the second thought which had been rolling around my empty cranium over the last fortnight, because it had suddenly dawned on me one day that the Sherman Brothers, who I think everyone who listens to Musical Talk will agree were a fantastic songwriting partnership, have been well represented on stage, at least in the sense that Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which has a magnificent Sherman Brothers score, has made a great hit on the stage for the last 10 or so years. And of course, I've already mentioned that Mary Poppins made the transition very successfully a few years later. Where, oh where, is Bedknobs and Broomsticks? So these thoughts were rolling around my mind, so I thought I'd better go and look online to see if there were any plans for Bedknobs and Broomsticks to appear on stage. And good news. Now, it may be that you knew this, but I didn't. But I was delighted to learn that it is. It's coming to a stage near us here in the United Kingdom, because it's having its world premiere on stage here in Britain at the Theatre Royal in Newcastle upon Tyne on the 14th of August later this year, 2021, and then it's going on a tour of the United Kingdom and Ireland until January 2022. It's not stopping off at London, at least on its current national tour programme, although, of course, if it does well, maybe we'll get to see it. But there are a number of places, certainly across the United Kingdom, that I've spotted that I think I might pop along to see it at. So, if you want to find out more about the stage version, the world premiere of Bedknobs and Broomsticks on Stage, the magical musical as it's subtitled, you can do so by going to the website www.bedknobsonstage.com. And if nothing else, there's a fairly nifty logo for you to look at, which has combined a bedknob and a broomstick. And incidentally gives you a view from underneath the bed, essentially, from the vantage point of the logo, and you can see that there's no chamber pot. However, all this thinking about Bedknobs and Broomsticks reminded me that I had a conversation with Tim Sayward of this parish many years ago, I think about 10 actually, where we discussed the restored version of the 1971 film. When it originally premiered, it was very long indeed, so a fairly barbaric edit was created for theatrical release, and that was the version that went round the cinemas periodically for years, and has become the standard version of the film Bedknobs and Broomsticks. But Disney, in their infinite wisdom, have created an extended version from what remaining materials still exist from prior to that cut. And it's that version that Tim and I watched. And it threw up a few surprises in itself. However, the film is great. And even if you've seen it 1,000 times, I think there's nothing on this planet which can ever truly prepare you for seeing Bruce Forsyth wielding a flick knife in anger. It's still one of the most surprising things I've ever seen. and I'm a very old man. So, let's wind back the clock and listen to that original conversation that I had with Tim Saywood about the 1971 extended version of Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which I hope will act as an appetiser for the new world premiere production which is about to go on tour in Britain and Ireland from this summer. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Tim Saywood. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Tim, hello.
Hello.
You appear to me to be reclining on a brass bedstead.
Yes.
Adorned by...
In Dorset, I thought you were going to say.
Well, Dorset would be appropriate.
It would.
Adorned with 4 brass bed knobs.
Indeed, yes. But what has this got to do with my knob?
Nothing, I'm just creating context.
I see, fair enough.
No, we've just seen the film Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
We have.
Which is
Which is amazing for people our age, really, isn't it?
It's not the first time we've seen it together either.
I think I might have seen it at the age of about maybe 5 or 6. I think possibly when I had chickenpox. Can't remember though if that's true or not. Anyway.
I'm not sure it has a huge relevance or any discussion we may or may not have.
None whatsoever.
I saw it several times. I saw it at the cinema when it was periodically re-released throughout the 70s and 80s when I was a boy.
Yes.
And then I've seen it a couple of times on television and once in your company before we watched it again today.
That's right, yes. We were watching today as then the 2001 reconstruction of Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which runs long and contains more than the theatrical cut of the film, particularly in the song department.
Yes, because the released version, the restored version, is about 2.5 hours long.
Yes.
And they cut about half an hour out for the
theatrical release, yes. Which included 3 of the songs. There's a song called A Step in the Right Direction, I think it's called. There's...
With a Flare.
Oh, a song called With a Flare, which I'm amazed, because I think of it as part of Bedknobs and Broomsticks, but then I've obviously not seen the TV cut, as it were, for a long time, or the theatrical cut. And there's one other, which I think is Don't Let Me Down, which is a sort of half of a song anyway. And it's
inserted into another, isn't it? Yes. Well, let's talk about it as a whole before we talk about some of the parts. I mean, one of the reasons we've watched it several times each and together is actually because we have a huge amount of affection for it.
It's a lovely film.
It's not without its faults, however.
Interestingly, it does go on a bit long, particularly in this version, and perhaps even in its original version. The most exciting part, and I think the part that most people remember, is the soccer match, or the football match, depending on where you're from, that happens in the sort of second half, as it were, because it is a film very much of 2 halves, in fact, ironically, which is a piece of animation genius which has been on Clips programmes ever since really it first came out.
It's actually one of the
1971
most raucous bits of Disney animation I can think of, actually.
Yes, I think you pointed out that it's quite cartoon violence, really. Yeah, Warner Brothers style violence. As in cartoonesque, but quite, you can sort of feel it sometimes.
Yeah. It's exuberant, actually, is what it has. More than anything else, it's exuberant and cheeky.
And pacey.
Yes.
Very pacey.
And in a sense shows up the rest of the film in that sense.
Yeah, because the earlier stages of the film do take quite a while to actually sort of get going plot-wise. And obviously the film that it's most compared to comes from the same stable, which is Mary Poppins, which came out, I think, something like 1964. This one wasn't until 1971. And they bear comparison in as much as they combine live action and animation. That they are British stories, although P.L. Travers wasn't actually British, but basically are set in a nostalgic
Edwardian Britain,
Edwardian or Second World War Britain, and are based on slightly wandering stories and sort of variegated source material from 2 different writers, P.L. Travers being the one for Mary Poppins, and which is a concatenation of quite a number of different stories, and then a sort of arc plot which never really existed in her stories. But in Bedknobs and Broomsticks is based on 2 books by Mary Norton, The Magic Bedknob, or How to Become a Witch in 10 Easy Lessons, and then a novel that she wrote 2 years after that, in 1945, called Bonfires and Broomsticks, and takes reasonable liberties, as I understand it, with the source material too. But Mary Poppins does seem to drive along a little bit more purposefully, despite the fact that when you think about it, it's quite an aimless story and just has a series of sort of sketches and moments. Bedknobs and Broomsticks also has a series of sketches and moments, but slightly fewer, I think, in total for the running time that it has. And it possibly does feel a bit slack because they put that extra half an hour back in as well.
Can I ask you a different question, though? I mean, we're talking about the characterisation here. I agree with you. I think Mary Poppins has a slightly stronger pace, has a slightly more even tone in the way it develops its scenes and sketches. It feels much more of a piece, even though, as you say, it's episodic. And we do like Bedknobs and Broomsticks, so no one should go away thinking that we don't. But in comparison, it's slower. The children's development in Mary Poppins and the children's development in Bedknobs and Broomsticks, I mean, in a sense, they are only the ciphers and create incident around which the grown-ups can then have their adventures, really, in both films, because the star is Angela Lansbury with David Tomlinson, very clearly. But I actually, although they are appallingly over-the-top, Cockney accented children in Bedknobs, I have a slightly...
One of whom is Irish, interestingly.
Well, I think there's a slightly stronger usage of those children than there is in Mary Poppins.
Well, I mean, it's both the films have sections, at least, or are about childhood. So, for example, A Spoonful of Sugar is about how one cares for children, but also about sort of how the children feel about it, I suppose. In Bedknobs and Broomsticks, we have, in particular, the song The Age of Not Believing, which is about a particular section of childhood, a more advanced section of childhood, age of childhood. And it sort of does touch on that. And I think probably the best developed character is the oldest boy because of that, because he has his moments of sort of, of being a bit of a wide boy when he turns up trying to sort of effectively blackmail Eglantine, the Angela Lansbury character.
Miss Price.
And then, his vulnerability becomes a bit more exposed just before they go off on the adventures. And then, as you say, he becomes totally plot irrelevant, as children often do at that point.
Yes, they set wheels in motion, don't they?
It's neither in Jane and Michael and Mary Poppins also don't... They do motivate the plot a little bit, though, don't they? Because it's their rejection, if you like, of the bank and the whole world of Mr. Banks that they go missing, and then as a result, that sort of the final plot sort of twists are sort of, as it were, they're doing, or Michael's doing, I think it is, and less Jane's. Whereas these kids really don't. Except
it's the youngest child who actually remembers the magic words that allows the substitutionary locomotion to take place.
And in a sense, the romantic story is also their creation, because it's their desire to see Miss Price get together with Emilius Brown, the David Tomlinson character, that drives that section of the story. In other words, he goes away because they don't think it's going to work out, but in fact, he sort of gets back together with her in the end. I think to make a complete family unit. And it's interesting that Mary Poppins, of course, breaks up its family unit, or except reassembles the correct family unit, having created a family unit out of Mary and the two children. But that's things out of balance, and then, of course, eventually the family unit comes together in the form of the mother and the father and
she
the two
trains
children.
the children, and then she trains the parents.
And then she leaves. Yes, exactly.
Whereas, as you say, the children are in a strange way the architects, or at least partial architects, of their own future, because it's actually established they're orphans right at the beginning, and have lost their guardian in an air raid blitz, because it's set in 1940, the dark days, at least in Britain, of the early years of the Second World War.
Yes.
When Britain actually was worried for its future and worried about invasion. And their guardian, who's an Aunt Bessie or Betty or something like that, she's been killed in the Blitz, unfortunately.
Yeah.
They're homeless because they're evacuees. They are orphans, so they're without parents. And they are given a mother, and they are suddenly sort of given a father. And it's really underplayed. I would not say that's what this is about, but it does happen.
Yes, it's very much in there, and it's very much, it's very Disney, isn't it, all of that? I mean, to fix the broken family and to create the family unit is pretty much what most Disney films do.
And Doctor Who quite often these days in the modern fantasy. Well, in children's fairy tale-ing.
Yeah. So it does a lot of that same job, but some of the places it stops off at are a little bit less diverting, but certainly the sequence on Nabumbu, the island where the football match takes place, is a classic. And there's also the whole Portobello Road sequence, which of course is very well known for the song of the same name. Very extended sequence there, which I think probably nods back to the supercalifragilistic expialidocious sequence, except that it's not in an animated context, but it has this very cornucopial sort of aesthetic to it, and in the middle of Portobello Road. And I wonder if there was a little bit of an influence from Oliver, which was 1968, where they had Consider Yourself. The number Portobello Road seems to partake of some of the same sensibility.
Well, it wouldn't be unlikely.
And of course, Ron Moody, as you were about to say...
I was, but you'd say it, Tim. You go right ahead.
Was originally cast as Emilius Brown. One can't help but imagine might have been slightly better, because in fact they did cast him, and he was then turned out his schedule didn't allow it, and then they cast David Tomlinson, and you can see that sort of how that character, the mountebank character, would have suited his style very well.
Well, we've discussed the plot to a degree. I mean, it's set up when these three children who are evacuated to a village or town in the west of Britain. There appears to be Corfe Castle in the distance.
Yes,
but it's somewhere Dorset.
It is meant to be specifically in Dorset. I think it's Peppering Eye is the name of the fictional village.
Which brings a tear, of course.
Yes, I suppose it would.
But yeah, so they're sort of allocated to Miss Price, who is training to be a witch.
Yeah,
and is learning it by correspondence course.
Yes, it's sort of like Goodnight, Mr. Tom, but Goodnight, Miss Witch.
Yes, but there's a remarkable fact. We were watching the extended version, and the first song in that version arrived half an hour in, which was the Age of Not Believing.
Age of Not Believing, that's right. Well, there's the Home Guard song, which of course comes very early on, but it doesn't really. It's sort of as if they're singing it, and it's not really a featured number.
No, it's
sense. Not. It doesn't sort of kick off thing. One of the first songs in Mary Poppins, I think, is the advert for the nanny, isn't it? I think if I've got that right, or it might be a little bit of the suffragette song. But yeah, it comes much earlier and sort of says this is a musical, by the way, as well as a caper,
which this one doesn't. But there is a song missing in that first half hour, which is not in the restored version, unfortunately, because they've lost the footage.
Yes,
it's just when Miss Price has unravelled her broom, which she's going to use to try to fly.
That's right.
And the song is called A Step in the Right Direction. And it's actually thematic for the whole piece thereafter.
Yes.
And it is, I believe you identified as a march as well, rather amusingly.
It is a classic Sherman Brothers march in either 6/8 or whatever you want to, however you characterise it, or 2/4.
But it's after all, it's a step in the right direction.
Which of course would be a very suitable thing to have a march for.
But the whole thing is about creeping slowly towards the finale, that she's learning to be a witch by a correspondence course.
Step by step.
In an episodic way, she meets and then slowly falls in love with the David Tomlinson character. The children are slowly getting their parents' family unit created.
Well, of course, when they animate all the with substitutionary locomotion, animate all the things. I mean, they set a lot of suits of armour marching, and that's what.
Well, it's a military battle at the end,
yes,
and of course exactly. You march and take steps in a military battle.
Another Sherman Brothers march there. In fact, there's a lot of marches in this, as indeed there are in Poppins. In Poppins, you have, what would we call a march from Poppins? A Spoonful of Sugar is a classic Sherman Brothers march,
and doesn't sound a million miles away from A Step in the Right Direction.
It's, I'd say, pretty similar, as indeed Substitutionary Locomotion also hails from the same sort of stable, if you like. In Poppins, well, you could say that Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious is a march of sorts, but the Sherman Brothers march really proliferates in Bedknobs and Broomsticks. So you've got the Old Home Guard, which is a march, because obviously
they march to it.
Yes. At the beginning. You've got, as we just mentioned, A Step in the Right Direction, which is a march because, again, it's a step. And you've also got With a Flare, which is a cut song, which we'll talk about shortly, which is also another classic Sherman Brothers march. Eglantine, which you could say is a march or not, depending on how you sort of interpret it. It's a bit of a jazzy one as it goes. And, of course, Substitutionary Locomotion, which is where the clothes and the shoes in particular start to march as well. It has a very coherent sound to it as a result of the soundtrack. Not to say rehearsing some of the same style perhaps a little too often. But
I disagree. I don't think there are too many marches in it.
Right.
I actually think, because I think they're the master of the melodic march. When you talk about a march, you think of the rhythm, but actually it's the melody, it's the songs. And I think you can enjoy this score without necessarily recognising the time signatures. And you're right, it does make it fairly cohesive, but I think you get that with a Sherman score anyway, to be honest.
Yes, well, there are further ones, Posh and stuff like that, in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and so on. Yeah.
But let's go back to A Step in the Right Direction, which is I think it's a great regret that the footage has been lost, which means they can't include it in the reconstruction. It was cut originally for timing purposes, but I think it's the one that sets out the stall for how the story's going to progress. So I think it's missing. I think it's a shame it's missing. And what's odd, of course, is that there is a sequence when Miss Price goes flying, and they use it instrumentally. So the echoes of the song are there, but they've taken out the nugget, which means that we actually go all the way through to 30 minutes in, before we really get the first bona fide proper sing-song,
Yes.
which is The Age of Not
Not
Believing.
Believing,
Now,
yes.
as we watched it, we actually made the observation could that have been because this is the moment when the magic starts
Yes.
for the children. This is where the adventure starts. Up to that point, it's all been set up.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they're about to go into the world of magic, flying on their bed, and then into the world of cartoons and all
Yes.
manner of adventures.
Yep.
So that's the one that starts, because it's all about belief. So my question to you is, are we supposed to be clever enough to realise that, in fact, the whole story is the imagination? They're lying on a bed. Could she be telling them a story, and the whole thing is an imagination story?
Well, I think I think Mary Poppins partakes of pretty much the same conceit, which is that, when the children come home singing Step in Time and, singing Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious and blabbing on about how they jumped into a painting in a park, the parents do indeed dismiss it as the nurse having basically played a game with them.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of fiction of this kind does sort of partake of that conceit. It might have been the imagination, things like The Box of Delights by John Masefield and so on, uses dream sequences and Alice in Wonderland. And I think the fact that there's... so I think it partakes of sort of dreamlike conceits, but I don't know that we're supposed to sort of understand that it doesn't happen.
No, I don't think we are either, in either of the films, funnily enough.
No, and in Mary Poppins, that's right, we believe the children, we don't believe the father, exactly. So I suppose that's my...
And Miss Price has an absolute belief all the way through that she's a witch.
That's right, yes. Although, which eventually she does decide against.
She relinquishes it, but she doesn't believe that she hasn't had the powers. It is... In fact, the real unbeliever in the piece is not the son, because he has it the eldest boy, because he's quickly...
sceptical, but he's converted.
Yeah, it's in fact actually Brown.
Tomlinson character, that's right. Who in fact perceives himself, rightly I think, as a fraud, which is what this number with a flare is all about.
Well, that's the next number, so let's talk about that.
He's a mountebank, yeah. He describes himself as a mountebank, a charlatan. It's actually an interesting number because it's very central to sort of establishing his character, which is therefore a shame that it was cut. But it does have a slightly weird thing about it, which is that he is saying things like that I'm a mountebank, that I'm a charlatan, and yet he's not sort of telling us, the audience, that. He seems to be telling the people who are immediately around him that.
The setting
who
is...
he's trying to kid.
Yeah, he's actually doing a magic show in the street, trying to sell off cheap magic tricks, and we're talking conjuring tricks, not real magic. We are talking, sleight of hand things, and he is quite poor because
he gets a lot of them wrong.
He gets a lot of them wrong, and the ones that don't go wrong, you can see how they're done.
Yeah,
he drops various sticks out of bits and pieces.
Shame they couldn't have got Tommy Cooper for it, really.
Well, that's a conceit, isn't it?
Yeah.
But he's doing it. But he's, as you say, he's singing and dancing and being very entertaining. Although none of his audience are enjoying it. But he is at the same time admitting that that it's all sleight of hand and a bit ropey.
It's all about doing it with a flair.
It's all sham and in the presentation. But as you say, is he actually singing? Can the people who are watching his appalling show hear his words? Could that explain why there is simply no response? They all just walk away at the end.
Yes, possibly. Yeah. It has a sort of slightly. It has a certain uncertainty to it, that song, along with sort of Egland Time, where there's a certain amount of things written into the songs which actually are already in the screenplay and that therefore sort of double up and don't really advance the plot. But it is a shame that we didn't get that manifesto song in the... Well, there we are, we have it now, so I suppose I shouldn't complain. But
as a song... I mean, there's a world of difference between cutting a song because a song isn't up to it and cutting a song for timing reasons or that it's unnecessary to a narrative. And I don't think you could possibly argue that it's not a good song.
But it does mean, again, that you don't get another song until Egland Time, which is the next one along. And you're very well into the action by that time. A nice song, very about persuading her to sort of partner up with him. Again,
because he's realised that she can really do magic, and he knows he's a sham.
Yes,
but if he can then use her together in a stage act,
and basically it's the setting up of their sort of romance as a couple,
relationship.
Basically. Yes, exactly. Well, it becomes a romance.
Yeah.
And,
well, he's obviously smitten with her very early on, and not just professionally, whereas she takes a long time to think of him as a part anything other than a sham.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, what is it that changes her mind? I mean, I think it's that he does prove himself useful in the end, doesn't he? I mean, he sort of secures the magic words, the MacGuffin that they go off into the soccer match to.
But he really comes into his own later on when they're out of their animated adventures and they've got back home, which is I suppose we'll call it the German invasion part of the plot towards the end.
Yes.
When in fact before that occurs, he actually shows that he can keep her feet on the ground, because when we first see her acting in the sort of loco parentis mother role for the the children who have been evacuated, she gives them completely inappropriate food. It's elm bark and mangel wurzel jam and all this kind of stuff, which she can, she's an odd spinster who lives on her own and thinks she's a witch, so she can do all that kind of thing. But you don't give that to 3 growing children who have been orphaned and come up from London wearing nothing but rags.
So what we're saying is that he can cook sausages.
Well, yeah, but the point is that he brings normality to her. She's got the common sense. Well, no, he's got the common sense, actually. Yeah. But she's got the imagination and the flight, but he's got the presentation skills. So, in a sense, they offset each other really well.
Yes.
They work very nicely as a family home. When he's cooking and made the normal meal... You
want to go and live there.
Well, yeah, he makes sausage and mash, which she says she could never do and doesn't know how to.
That's right.
And he can make her laugh, because he does a juggling act which goes horribly wrong. Yes. The children are happy. Suddenly, it's the first still moment of
And he's from London,
pleasure.
And he understands the children better because he's from London.
Yeah, that's true.
They're very delighted. Certainly the eldest child is very delighted when he first smells the sort of smoggy smell of old London
town. Well, actually, the children
Road.
The children and Brown are much more worldly than Miss Price.
Yes.
Who is out of this worldly because she's a witch.
She's a witch. Yes.
So that was, but the song Eglantine, as you say, is much earlier on, where he is trying to persuade her, but he's obviously keen on her as well.
Yes, that's right.
There's an
It's much more his song than hers.
Oh God, yes.
Because
she'd seem a bit rum if she was singing it to herself.
Well, indeed, yes. But her characterisation at this point is reluctance, is sort of let's just get on with what I've actually come here to do, which is to find the rest of this spell.
She's mission operated, isn't she?
And he's getting much more distracted by the commercial potential of the relationship that they could have. And so, in tone, and because it's one of those sort of upbeat polka-y type of marches, he's it exudes enthusiasm and whereas she is sort of scolding and it reminds me a little bit of Sign, which is a song from the film of Annie but not from the stage show, in which of course this comedy couple are trying to sort of get something out of each other, and one succeeds and the other very much fails, and the determined one. But in this case it's the flighty one, i.e. him, who carries the day musically. You can hear in the music that it's much more about that.
It's funny you should say that, because you've mentioned on several occasions there's quite a lot of gender play in this, it must be said. He makes a lot of chauvinistic comments about women, and then ultimately it's always him who gets something wrong. So he talks about women losing things, and then he loses something very important.
Book,
and actually it's him, it's set in 1940. As I say, later on you see he's the wow in the kitchen.
Yes.
So actually all the way through, funnily enough, using old-fashioned gender stereotypes, he is the woman and she is the man.
Yes, I suppose in a sense.
Because she's dedicated to fighting the war. That's why she wants to become a witch.
Yeah.
She's very intent on completing her mission.
Yes, yeah. And she's the more moral one for those reasons as well, which obviously we sort of accept. But he finds something in himself, and of course eventually he reforms in order to become a soldier and to go off and fight the war.
Well, she's got 2 reluctant suitors in the whole piece, isn't she? Because there's the Roddy McDowall character who plays this odd local vicar who's not in it much, but he obviously fancies Miss Price, but he's identified as a coward at the beginning. Why haven't you been called up? And he comes up with some fake reason about ill health, which is clearly a fabrication. So, but we also learn very early on that Brown is a coward. But Brown actually does what he needs to do when the moment comes. When the German invasion comes, he goes back to help the town and Miss Price. He doesn't run away when he sees them at the railway. He could have easily have hidden at the railway station where he first sees the Germans.
Yes.
The Nazis in this case. But he doesn't. He goes back to help, and then at the very end, when he's helped defeat the German invasion with Miss Price, he then actually joins the army. He's not unprepared to fight. So, although it's not really played up, she is offered the choice, whether she wants it or not, at the beginning of 2 cowards. But one coward is actually redeemed through bravery.
Yes, I suppose that's true. We should talk about Tessie O'Shea and en passant as well. This woman from the Celtic fringes somewhere.
Well, Tessie O'Shea was a very famous British and indeed Welsh singer. She worked with Noel Coward. She was in one of the great Noel Coward musicals, which he did in America, and she sang a whole series of mock music hall numbers that Noel Coward had written, including What Ho Mrs Brisket.
What a lovely title.
What Ho Mrs Brisket, why not take a chance at risk it? The water's warm and there ain't no crabs, and you'll have a lot of fun amongst the shrimps and dabs. And if for a lark some saucy old shark will nibble at your chocolate biscuit, run for the shore and the crowd will roar. What ho, Mrs Brisket.
That makes me want to talk about the beautiful briny, actually. Let's leave Tessie aside for a moment.
We'll be coming back to Tessie O'Shea because something very strange happens to her.
Yes. But the Beautiful Briny, which of course is another classic sequence from the animated sequence from the show, and is a song originally written for Mary Poppins and very much in the style of it. You certainly could imagine Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke
on a bed,
that.
sailing through the sea.
It's a little bit sort of in the style of It's a Jolly Holiday with Mary, in as much as it's quite a syncopated sort of thing which has jazz overtones to it. But Beautiful Briny is a little bit later. It's a sort of, a dance hall number from the 30s or 40s. With, as we were saying, crooning and
medley of
through
styles,
megaphones and that sort of thing. Yeah, and
there's a kind of Sambury moment. Yeah,
it's all ballroom stuff basically. So effectively, we have a ballroom beneath the waves, and very much not in the style of Under the Sea, which of course is a calypso Caribbean tune.
A much later Disney Under the Water extravaganza.
Yes, indeed.
This, I think, is the more successful actually because it's funnier as well, more characterful.
Yes.
It's also, I have to say, I think it's the first truly exuberant moment in the piece. We haven't done Portobello Road, which actually precedes it.
Yes.
But whereas Portobello Road tries to be exuberant but doesn't quite do it, the Beautiful Briny does.
Yes.
The question is, was it animated for Mary Poppins and then had the bed put over it later? Or was it an idea from Mary Poppins, which they then animated?
I believe it was the latter. And
so it was on the storybook.
I think it was in the score of Mary Poppins, and perhaps they considered that they just had enough stuff of that type, basically. Yes, I very much doubt that it was animated for Mary Poppins, because we're talking quite some years separating the two things. Although it does take a long time, but
and it feels cohesive in the style of the animation, which is quite sketchbooky. Actually, it's grotesque, larger than life. Disney. It's not his early period of beauty. In fact, it's after Disney died, which Mary Poppins wasn't, of course.
No, that's right.
Although it owes such a debt to it. But as you say, Beautiful Briny is a great number musically, beautifully played and arranged. It's amusing and light.
And I wonder also we enter the world of visual humour here instead of cultural humour. So whereas I think some of the early stages of it's a slightly shaky recreation of the England of the day, albeit intentionally nostalgic and not untruthful. Really, when you go into the animated sequences, you're really in an American story because the king, has a sort of American accent and...
well, I think he's a kind of, I don't know, Englishman that you only hear in American adaptations of British stories.
Yes, well, I think he sounds more American than that to me, certainly, yeah. And he's not quite in sort of Bert Lahr, is it, territory, or whoever that was.
Cowardly Lion from Wizard of Oz, yeah.
But
he's much more dominating than that.
It just becomes much more about the visual humour of the thing and about, I suppose, that classic trope of the sort of the Englishman in the middle of a socially embarrassing situation, which works so well over the centuries. So the film does change character. It picks up pace. The visual humour becomes much more important at that stage. Yeah. All in all, it's a very successful number.
Well, it has actually been, you're quite right, up to that point, the real life parts have been, up to the point, character driven.
Yes.
Whether you've been successful in that is another matter, but it has been character driven, and then, as you say, we're into the world of absolute fantasy. Yes. But let us step back, because we're saying Beautiful Briny Sea is a really successful piece, musically, animatedly, in direction, as in character. All of it works really, really nicely.
Yep.
Let's go back to the big showpiece number beforehand, which is the Portobello Road number.
Yes.
Which goes on for a very long time and is not unpleasant, perfectly enjoyable, but it doesn't quite hit the mark. Why doesn't it quite hit the mark?
We said earlier that it sort of owed a debt to Consider Yourself from Oliver, because it's a street scene, there is a diversity of people, each of whom takes a turn. In this case, a diversity of forces, soldiers, who we start with some sailors who I think they're
doing their on the town moment.
They're Jack Tars or American sailors. Couldn't tell from the uniform.
They look British to me.
Yeah, okay. So and then
it was more blue than white.
A lot of different Commonwealth countries. Well, it's a lot. I mean, there are Indian soldiers. There are Caribbean soldiers from
playing calypso music,
Jamaica or elsewhere playing calypso music. I don't think it's that specific, to be honest. And then a diversity, and then Welsh, Irish. Actually, we don't get Welsh particularly, but we do get Scottish and Irish.
Yeah.
Northern Irish, one assumes, with the Republic being neutral
in the Second World War, but they were very full-on jigs.
Indeed. And And that sort of general flags of all nations type of sort of thing. But
well, it's the London melting pot idea, actually, isn't it? Although in a slightly segregated way, because
everybody
the
has
Scots
their own
dancers
music.
don't talk to anyone else.
But it doesn't quite add up to the sequence that certainly something like Consider Yourself does, where everybody's singing the same tune effectively and the same orchestration. It's just a series of episodic sketches, which is interesting because you do get just the same thing as we were saying earlier in the later song in the Briny Sea, where you have like a moment of Latin and a moment of jazz and a moment of warbling and all the rest of it. But for some reason it just doesn't quite, as you say, it must be to do with the pace.
It doesn't gel quite, does it?
But also, what are they singing about? They're singing about Portobello Road, place where the riches of ages are stowed. Why does that compute to, like, it? You know, it's an everybody together number is what they were trying to go for there, and it doesn't quite gel.
You see, the thing is, I think going to Portobello Road Market, which is a famous street market for antiques and bric-a-brac, and is still going strong.
And is a place of great diversity.
Yeah. Oh, it certainly is. It's Ladbroke Grove Way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is one of the first places where West Indian people stayed in London famously, shall we say.
If you've ever seen Absolute Beginners, yeah.
Yeah.
Notting Hill area.
And in real life, not just in the world of musical theatre, Tim.
Indeed, yes.
But actually, when you look at it, they are going there for different reasons. She is pursuing a bookseller because she believes that she's looking for the book of Astragoth or Astroloth or whatever,
Astaroth.
who's the wizard whose magic she turns out she's using, and she's got half his book, but she's looking for the other half, which was originally sold on one stall somewhere. So she is looking for something in relation to her drive to become a witch.
Yeah.
Amelius Brown, of course, is very carried away by the sales technique and the overtop.
Yes,
So
he's not
likes
there to do anything really. He's just there to sort of to be there.
Yeah, well, he's taking her to the shop where he bought the book in the first place.
Right.
But the children are very quickly distracted and amused by the showing parts of Portobello Road. It's not just their facility. They are, the whole stall holders are happily dancing and playing and singing and giving. At the beginning of the song, there's lyrics, and they're talking about the fake stuff on display, which is being passed off as real. Which, if you don't mind me saying, is a thematic idea throughout the whole piece.
Yeah.
And also, he's overwhelmed and delighted and pleased by their, salesman's technique, which he sees through because he's also a sham. He reveals that all the stuff they're talking about is absolute nonsense.
Supposed cigars or whatever painted last week in whenever
on the banks of the Thames and all that kind of stuff. Yes, absolutely. So. And then, as you say, it turns into a great old knees up, basically, when someone starts playing a musical instrument from a stall.
That's right.
And then pretty much it turns out that 95% of anyone who happened to be walking down Portobello Road on that day could either sing or dance or perform.
Yes.
Which was lucky.
Yes, it was.
It didn't happen in Chiswick High Street the other day when I started playing a cornet, although it was an ice cream cornet, so why would they?
It wouldn't work, presumably you played ice cream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream. I don't know. It's a fun song, but it's not Step in Time, and it's not It's a Jolly Holiday with Mary.
Yeah.
But both of which I think it's supposed to partake of, again, that sort of feeling of the holiday day, the day when you're walking out in the park, you're tourists, you're just soaking up the atmosphere of a wonderful place. And
as you said,
maybe it just falls in the wrong place in the thing. They've set off on their mission by this time to do further touristing at this point.
Beside the point.
Maybe they should have done it earlier. I don't know.
Although Miss Price doesn't want to. She's constantly looking for this book.
That's what I mean, yeah, exactly. Anyway.
Shortly after this, it must be said...
Mary Poppins doesn't have a purpose in her life. I mean, that is to say, yes, she does have a purpose, but it's intrinsic in taking the children into the paintings and all of that sort of stuff. Whereas she actually is not about amusing the children. She's about, as you say,
teaching,
trying to do her thing.
It's shortly after this, and I think we have to mention it just because he's one of Britain's greatest song and dance men, that a very miscast Bruce Forsyth turns up as a heavy.
Yes, indeed, yes.
Oh, knife-wielding heavy of all things. Talk about ruin your career's reputation.
Yeah, well, it didn't do his much harm, I think it's fair to say, but he is still around.
I love Brucey, so don't get me wrong. I think Brucey is a fantastic entertainer, and he can do almost anything. But acting is not his first skill, and he's required in here to play a proper thug.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And
which
it doesn't
sort of
quite...
makes a feint at, I suppose. Yeah, he's all right.
But he doesn't sing and dance.
It's more just interesting to see him, really, isn't it?
A young Brucey.
A young Brucey, yes, who looks not that different to the old one, I would say. He hasn't changed that much over the years.
No.
He was never a looker, was he?
But he has a very distinctive look, I think that's fair to say.
Yes, never a looker. So that's Brucey. We must return to Tessie O'Shea briefly, because we've now talked about people from all nations of the United Kingdom and beyond. And in the reconstruction, there are several scenes, which we haven't said yet, where they've had to redub them because the footage exists or the soundtrack was... I don't know exactly what the reason was, but the soundtrack was poor quality or had been lost or something like that from these cut scenes that they were restoring to the
these
film.
aren't necessarily the songs always. These are actually dramatic
scenes. These are usually
scenes,
dialogue scenes where they've had to re-voice the characters using the footage, making them sound as most like the original they can. And I have to say that in the case of Tessie O'Shea, it's an utter abject failure.
Yes, there's various degrees. Let's start. I mean, David Tomlinson is voiced by someone else who's clearly an American actor doing a British accent.
Yeah.
But it's passable. It's not brilliant, and you can spot it, but it's passable. It doesn't jar so much that you think, oh my goodness, that's not David Tomlinson. No. You might spot it, but it doesn't stop you believing in that character. As you say, tell us about Tessie.
Tessie begins in somewhere, well, I'd say somewhere in mid-Wales, I'd say, which is in fact her own voice, because the soundtrack
Welsh
from her initial scene does indeed exist. But the next time you see her, she seems to have, she sort of seems to drift around somewhere in the area of the Isle of Arran, as in slightly north of Wales, but slightly south of Scotland, but definitely nowhere in between. Yeah. So...
I think she gets progressively Scots throughout that scene.
Yes, she does. Yeah, she becomes. There are some Welsh accents where there is a little bit of a burr in them and a sort of the rhotic R and a little bit of the what you relate to as Scots, but none of them quite that much, I have to say.
To me, with an untrained
and indeed, there are some Outer Hebridean accents which start to sound a little bit more Welshy because they drop some of the distinctive what you think of as the Scottish thing accents. But
let's be brutal
they don't
about
sound
this.
Welsh.
Yeah, the brutal thing about this is that Tessie O'Shea does sound Welsh at the beginning of the film,
Scottish in the middle, and then back to Welsh again towards the end when it's her own voice again.
And it's overtly Scottish. I think you've been far too generous. I think she just sounds like it's like her twin sister who's lived for her entire life in the Highlands, has come down for the postmistress scene and then disappeared again. It's hilarious.
It's brilliant.
But it's very wrong.
Yes, exactly.
We didn't hear a word of the dialogue in that scene because we were too busy going, what the business is going on here?
We haven't talked about Substitutionary Locomotion, which is, again, we talked about it being in March, and I think is probably my favourite song from the film, actually, although... Oh, no, it's not, actually, but we'll come on to what my favourite song is in a second.
It's a good song. It's a great song.
It's certainly among the best, and it's... a very enjoyable, and of course it has the magic words.
It's a great Sherman Brothers tongue-twistery nonsense word song. Yeah.
In fact, really, its closest relation is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, except it's sort of like that, but as it were, to the tune, or at least the rhythm of a spoonful of sugar.
Yeah.
So, and they recite the things, and I don't think there's a lot to say about it, really. It's just a nice, as you say, tongue-twistery song which has a very exuberant, to use a word you used earlier, sequence with all of the clothes coming to life and stuff like that. And it's quite an advanced film in the sense of like the visual effects are
they're good
you
for
can
71.
see the wires occasionally, but they're pretty I suppose convincing is not the word I'm searching for, but you really feel like you can go along with them.
Yeah.
In the same sense,
you can buy into them.
You're not convinced by Roger Rabbit in the sense you don't think that's happening in reality. It was like all live action, but you're impressed by the techniques that it comes together so beautifully.
It's also tonally right.
Yeah.
I agree. I actually think Substitutionary Locomotion is a great song, and I'm going to be slightly controversial here. I actually find it slightly more catchy than Supercalifragilistic. Now, I know that Supercalifragilistic is a marvellous song and a great tongue twister, and done so perfectly by Dick Van Dyke and.
Well, I wouldn't say perfectly. I mean, when we talk about accents,
no. But they pitch it absolutely right. But Substitutionary Locomotion, for me, has a better hook. I find myself more likely to hum or whistle Substitutionary Locomotion on days when I'm not watching Bedknobs and Broomsticks than I ever am. I have to be reminded.
Measured this scientifically. I think you should be.
Do you not keep a Sherman Brothers song log?
Yes, or a Shermanometer. Yes, it was very good. And I think of their three scores, if we take them together, including Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which although not produced by Disney was
of a type.
Very much of that same type and very much falls into that.
Similar time period as well.
And also doesn't feature that many songs. I think... what's your favourite score out of those? I think Poppins is probably just about my favourite score, but certainly it's not Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which I find a lot less charismatic, actually.
It won't be Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, no. I mean, we know the really good song for Chitty Chitty BangAng is the title song.
It's the title song, yeah.
And Hush by Mountain if you want something a bit more sentimental, which I don't. Do you know?
And the Old Bamboo, which is basically a retread of Step in Time.
Right. Well, it depends how. Yeah, but it depends on how you measure which is your favourite. Because actually, I will accept that Mary Poppins is a better film than Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Yeah.
But actually, I would rather listen to Bedknobs and Broomsticks than the score of Mary Poppins. And I tell you, I can actually put my money where my mouth is, because I've actually got songs from Bedknobs on my iTunes and periodically on my iPod, and they do come up on shuffle. And I don't have Mary Poppins' score.
No,
it's a better film, but I think
interesting
it's more enjoyable.
Interesting,
in Bedknobs.
Unlike Mary Poppins, although indeed it had taken very many years before Mary Poppins got staged, that they haven't yet done Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and I'm assuming rights is probably part of the reason, and the fact that you'd have to do all the sort of you'd have to do Beautiful Briny Sea and the number we just talked about, Substitutionary Locomotion, very well visually, but none of them are beyond the sort of techniques of theatre that we've seen so far. Clothes coming to life and stuff like that. I mean,
in fact, now's the time.
Ultraviolet was the way that used to be done, and obviously combination of animation and live action is possible on stage now in a way that it never really was. Certainly 10 years ago. So I wonder if they will get round to it eventually, or whether it needs a bit of organising into a slightly different story, as they did with Mary Poppins. It's basically the same story you get in the stage version of Mary Poppins, but worked in a slightly different way.
I wonder if the problem with it is, ironically, the Nazi invasion part.
Why is that?
Well, it works quite nicely ultimately the whole thing works towards repelling a Nazi. It's not actually an invasion, but it's a skirmish.
Yes.
It's a boarding party.
Reconnaissance mission,
if you like.
I suppose.
But this is a dreadful thing to say, but would you, in a world which is now global, make a Disney musical is a franchise musical?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would say...
Would you play it in Berlin?
I don't.
Easily.
I think Nazis generally aren't considered nice people in Berlin.
Oh no, I agree with that.
But also, I mean, The Sound of Music would be my obvious counterexample, because The Sound of Music has Nazis as its main villains and gets done to this day.
Yeah, no, you're right. I'm talking nonsense. You are correct.
Yeah.
I was not saying, by the way, that I believe that current German culture in any way reflects the sins of the past. No. I don't think it's that's holding it up. I think maybe it's the fact that it would need some reorganisation and some re-scripting, I think, to have the pace or to have the structure because I think the first act would be the problem, unusually, for a musical, because it's normally the second act. But actually, once you go to the island and it sort of has that structure of Dick Whittington, doesn't it? Yeah. They go off to an exotic island and get the sort of magic thing that they need and bring it back and use it, basically, to win whatever it is that they need to win. And all of that second half works very well, which is probably where the reputation of the film comes from more, because people leave feeling they've had some very solid entertainment definitely in that last hour. But the first half is a little bit uneven in its pace, and maybe that would be the thing that they'd need to work up. And also, she's, for someone who's is this sort of supposedly crabby recluse, she doesn't really go there, does she, Angela Lansbury? She seems quite nice all the way through. And I wonder if they pulled the punch there a little bit, and maybe she doesn't go through enough of a change in the course of the story. Do you see her as crabby?
Well, no, I don't.
I see her as single-minded.
Well, I think, but I think what one would expect more from that sort of character, if you think of things like Goodnight, Mr. Tom, for example, which are the sort of classic evacuee stories, or Nina Carey's War, or things like that. Usually the story is of these good-hearted, hard-bitten but good-hearted kids winning over the gruff and crabby, and reclusive countryside person who never wanted to have kids posted on them in the first place. But they don't go really through very much conflict between the Miss Price and the children, which I think maybe would give the story a bit of impetus in the first thing. It's just that you then have to be won over by her.
Yeah.
And Disney obviously wanted to pull that particular punch. Whether they would have done with everybody they might have cast is an interesting question, but which we will probably never know the answer to.
I think it's fairly likely. We'll never know, absolutely.
I'm sure, yes. But I reckon someone will stage it at some point, and I think probably it'll be done in the West End in one of these years. We've talked about pretty much all of it now.
I think we should talk just briefly on the old Home Guard.
Yes.
Partly because it's historically inaccurate, because in 1940 there wasn't a Home
Guard.
Local
Defence Volunteers, as you were telling me, yes.
I was, because that's my little fact and I like it.
Yes.
But actually, it's once again, it's another good march.
Yes.
But of course, in Britain at least, when people think the Home Guard and they think of a march, they think of the Dad's Army theme.
They do.
And Dad's Army was 1968. So it already had its thunder stolen before the film was made, of course, at least in Britain. I've actually been to events where I've heard army bands playing the theme tune to Dad's Army.
Right.
Actually, on glockenspiels, amongst other things. It's... It was a surreal experience.
Well, that was written for the series, wasn't it?
Yes.
That theme, and often people thought, because it was done by Flanagan, or was it Bud Flanagan?
It was Bud Flanagan. It was the last thing he ever recorded.
Died at that point.
Well, Chesney Allen was still alive, but had retired.
Right. Okay.
But it's the last thing Bud Flanagan did before he died.
All right. Okay. And of course, therefore, people tended to think it was an original song of the war. Anyway, that's by the by. So yeah, I reckon we'll see it done at some point, and it will just take a certain amount of imagination in the story and the plotting to sort of bring it to make it a fully satisfying, story.
Well, here's my question
and
for you.
Probably some new songs. I wonder who could possibly write them, because obviously Stiles and Drew did Mary Poppins, and it would strike me that this would be very much up their alley as well.
Oh yes. But you have hinted heavily that there's a song which is your favourite.
Oh,
but you have not revealed what it is. I think most
of
us can guess. Anyone who knows you, Tim.
It's the age of not believing, which of course is the central, as you quite rightly have said, thematic sort of thing in the whole film. And
as it was structured for the cinema.
Yeah.
I don't think it is if we'd actually seen the original cut.
Well, maybe not.
But come on.
Yeah, and it's just a very beautiful song, and it changes that character's mind. Well, actually, that and a combination of a cat.
Yeah.
It changes his mind. Called Cosmic Creepers, was it?
Yes.
I think. Yes, a brilliant name.
Straight out of the world of Scooby-Doo.
And yeah, it just captures something very true, I think, in the same way that its counterpart in Mary Poppins, which is Stay Awake. It's a song that persuades via suggesting the opposite almost. So Mary Poppins is very explicit: stay awake, don't fall asleep, and of course it has the exact opposite effect, and they're asleep before they know it. And that's very satisfying. And in a sense that she says, you don't believe in anything, do you? You can't be persuaded by magic. You rush around, and you're very cynical and everything like that. And by the end of it, you can see that he's a frightened little boy, whereas before he's been this hard-bitten kid. And that she's got at that.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's so beautiful about it, because it's just, it's an emotional. It's probably it is the emotional song of the film, isn't it?
So it's also
very true.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, it's a rite of passage song for every child, whether boy or girl. But I can only speak from having been a boy. There is that moment, isn't it, where you're just on the cusp of giving up your childish ways, but you haven't yet become an adult, certainly, and you haven't yet necessarily become a teenager. You're just starting to see that.
You realise that the world, as it's been represented to you by well-meaning adults over the years, is a lie to a certain extent, and the suggestion is in the song that you give up on believing that it can be a good place after all, because it turns out that it certainly isn't the good place that it was represented to be. But
it's the song. But if Stephen Sondheim had been writing a Disney musical, would probably still be in this show.
Yes, I think so. Well, there's two songs that actually smack of Sondheim. That is one of them.
Tell me about the Sondheim smackers.
The other one is also cut from the film in its original theatrical thing, but has been restored for the 2001 reconstruction, and is called Nobody's Problems. And basically it's one of those sort of self-deluding songs where Miss Price sings to herself, the David Tomlinson character having left, apparently, possibly for good, to go off and be involved in whatever he was going to be involved in next. Where she sort of sings a little hymn to the single life and not having anyone's problems to deal with and nobody's demands to meet, or all of the rest of it.
She can go back to being the person she was.
And although musically it's nothing like Sondheim, it's a sentimental tune of the show.
It's a Sherman-esque song, yes.
But the lyrics do sort of irresistibly make one think just towards company, which had been the year before, someone to love you too much, someone to... the sort of opposite of that, in as much as, it's a view of love which is distancing, and which is sort of basically hold love at arm's length. And that is, if Sondheim ever influenced Disney, which I suppose he did actually, that's one area where maybe you can hear it for the first time, or at least that sort of more... a mature perspective on things, because of course she has reached another layer of not believing at that stage, because she's been disappointed. This is the
middle age of not believing.
This is where not believing. This is where you lose your. Disney wants everybody to believe. That's effectively the conceit of their things. They want everybody to believe in a beautiful, happy family. They want everybody to believe in a beautiful dream, and that's what Disney's sort of ideology is, if you like. And two characters in this suffer disappointments the boy, because, and by implication his siblings, but particularly him, because obviously life has been unfair up to that point and has turned out to be
horrible.
Has turned out to be a bit of a lie, and to her, because she suffered the disappointment, first of all, of thinking that he was a great man, first of all, via the correspondence course, and realising that he also is a mountebank, a charlatan, and finally that he's also maybe not going to be as constant as she was beginning to hope at the point at which the children suggested that thing. And of course, in true musical theatre style, she doesn't sing that directly. No. She sings the opposite, and we know that she's thinking the opposite to what she's singing. So it's a nicely put together concept.
She finds innocence through cynicism.
Yes, that's right. And of course, everybody in Disney comes back to believing eventually. Most of the rest of us never do. And that's why they're very poignant songs, because actually the age of not believing really should last forever, in my view.
That's a lovely, and I don't want to sour that moment, but you're absolutely right, because even the Nazis, who were basically booted off Dover, it looks like, even though it can't be, it's in Dorset, but they're booted off the British shore, back to the sea to their submarine.
The Jurassic coast.
That's right. Yeah. They are made to believe. First of all, the German commandant says very overtly, "I don't believe in witches," and then it's made very plain by his number 2 that he clearly does believe in witches.
Yes, and here's one. Yeah.
And then also, they can't believe. They believe it to be a trick, and of course, it is in fact magic armour that's seeing them off. Even though the Home Guard turn up just at the very nick of time to give it a rational ending, so people can believe if they want that they were driven off by the Home Guard. Sorry, the local defence volunteers.
Yes,
that's what I meant to say. But I think not that we see the Germans again once they're in their dinghies getting back to the U-boat. But I think we have to assume that they also now believe in magic because they're rotters. Naturally, it's magic has worked against them because magic only does good things, apparently. But
in Disney,
it is. Yes. It's interesting because I have a personal problem. I don't like things with magic in, but I do like this film, partly because it's so nonsensical. It doesn't take it's not pretending actually to tell me that magic does exist. Really.
Well, I mean...
So, in fact, Disney has completely failed on me. I don't believe it at all.
Yeah, it's true. They do want people to believe in magic, but I think people believe in it in the way that people believe in magic and stories.
It's Disney magic,
they don't believe in it. They actually sort of know.
But they believe it within the world that's been created.
The world is not quite so nice, but it would be nice if it was that nice. I have to just pay tribute, as I think I did at the beginning, to the fact that they do put, with an entirely straight face, the youngest kid in it has to say, "What has that got to do with my knob?"
Quite a lot, actually.
Yes, it turns out.
Put your knob on the bed.
And I'm glad.
Twist it.
I'm glad they kept that line in, although it always causes a frisson of disturbance to cross my mind every time I hear him say it.
Well, actually, one must say that, because although it's a British film absolutely populated with British actors, it's been populated with British actors who've lived in America for a very long time.
Yeah.
And has a huge American sensibility to it. Not that that's a bad thing, but it jars if you're British. There is just a few cultural moments where it doesn't quite work.
Yes.
We've already mentioned Tessie O'Shea's rambling different accents. But we notice at the end...
a staple of this kind of film with Dick Van Dyke and everything.
But at the very end, they do that very traditional thing in films where they report the outcome of something you've just seen in a newspaper, and it's clearly a British newspaper, except they've spelt rumour the American way and not the British way. There's no U in it, as there would be if it was published in the Times. Can you give me 2 final words on
I don't know if I can give you 2 final words.
On Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Maccoides Satis D, and the other ones, Trigorum, and what was the other one? I forget. I always thought he was a character from Anton Chekhov's The Seagull, but I've obviously got that wrong. Pretty satisfying. How about that?
That's very good. I like that, yes.
And Poppins-esque in some ways.
That's one word.
Yes.
I can only use 2 words which describe my own feelings for it, which is highly affectionate. Thank you, Jim. It's been a great pleasure to see you lounging on your bed. Now, if you'd be kind enough to tap your knob 3 times, turn it to the left.
Yes, I will. Thank you.
And tell me where you're going.
I think I should be going anywhere after I've done that, but never mind.
Casualty.
Yes.
Musical talk. Well, there we have it. That was Tim Sayward and me in conversation some years ago talking about the extended version of Bedknobs and Broomsticks. And, as I say, the most exciting thing that's happening, as far as I can see in relation to this particular film, is its forthcoming adaptation for the stage. Go along to www.bedknobsonstage.com to find out more details. And such details as there are quite intriguing, because I see, very much like Mary Poppins, there are some additional songs being added to that fantastic Sherman Brothers score. And they are written by Neil Bartram. And the book for the stage version has been written by Brian Hill. And tickets are booking now. So jump onto that brass bedstead while you can. Well, that's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed this walk down memory lane. Bedknobs and Broomsticks is one of those films that I always enjoy every time I revisit it. And so revisiting a conversation about it has been equally interesting, at least to me. I leave it to you to decide if the same is true for you. And to give you thinking time, I'm going to stop talking, which is everybody's dream. And as you know, by now, we have a little tradition here on Musical Talk, which is when I need to be shut up, the magic word will do it. Let's waste no further time, certainly of your time, with waiting for that word. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited by Thos Ribbits and presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Saywood. Copyright Musical Talk 2021. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. Last words on...
Bedknobs and Broomsticks are my last two words on that.
Those are 3 words.
Oh, no.